Imagine being locked in a concrete box for 23 hours a day, with no chance of escape, no human touch, and no certainty about whether you'll live or die. In America, two worlds collide. The sterile silence of ADX Florence, the so-called Alcatraz of the Rockies, and the haunting corridors of death row, where inmates wait for decades under a sentence that may never be carried out. This is the story of power, punishment, and the human cost of justice in its most extreme form. In the high desert of Colorado, about 2 hours south of Denver, sits the most secure prison the United States has ever built. The Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence. Opened in 1994, this supermax was designed after a series of deadly incidents inside other federal prisons, including the murders of guards at USP Marion in the 1980s. Federal officials wanted a place where the most dangerous, high-profile, and disruptive prisoners could be completely isolated, neutralized, and contained. The result was a facility that has often been called a clean version of hell. The statistics tell part of the story. ADX was built to house about 490 men, though its population usually hovers closer to 400. Each prisoner lives alone in a concrete cell, roughly 7 by 12 feet, with a solid steel door, a narrow window angled toward the sky, and a bed, desk, and stool, all molded from poured concrete. Even the shower is inside the cell, operated remotely by guards to reduce inmate movement. Meals are passed through a slot in the door. Communication is limited, visits are rare, and contact with other prisoners is nearly non-existent. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, inmates at ADX spend 23 hours a day alone, with their only exercise in a small outdoor pen often compared to a dog kennel. But ADX is more than just a prison. It is a fortress. Layers of razor wire encircle the perimeters. Guard towers and armed patrols monitor the grounds. Inside, cameras, motion sensors, and remote-controlled steel doors make sure that every move is watched. The entire complex is designed around the principle of total control. Escape, officials say, is not just difficult, it is impossible. And in the 3 decades since ADX opened, there has never been a confirmed successful escape attempt. The prison's roster reads like a dark roll call of American criminal history. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Mexico's most infamous drug lord, was transferred here after his dramatic tunnel escape from a Mexican prison. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, convicted for the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, is serving his life sentence inside these walls. Terry Nichols, co-conspirator in the Oklahoma City bombing, calls ADX home. Before his death, the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski spent years inside one of its concrete cells. Others include Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber. Each inmate is housed under a regime designed to prevent any form of collusion, conspiracy, or rebellion. Yet the story of ADX is not just about security. It is about the human mind under extreme isolation. Over the years, journalists, lawyers, and human rights organizations have raised alarms about the psychological effects of life inside the supermax. Former inmates have described hallucinations, paranoia, depression, and self-harm. In fact, in a 2012 lawsuit filed by a group of prisoners, attorneys argued that the prison systematically ignored mental health needs, locking severely ill men in isolation without adequate treatment. The lawsuit eventually led to a settlement requiring reforms, but questions remain. Even staff have privately admitted that ADX is less a place of rehabilitation than a place of warehousing, where men are stored until they die. But while no one has escaped the walls of Florence, prisoners have sought other ways out, through legal challenges, hunger strikes, and appeals to international human rights bodies. Some have argued that the isolation itself amounts to torture under the United Nations standards. Others have pointed to the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Federal courts, however, have often been reluctant to intervene, giving prison officials broad discretion to manage the most dangerous inmates in the country. Still, the debates surrounding ADX cannot be separated from the larger American prison system. Because just as ADX represents the extreme of physical security, another institution, death row, represents the extreme of punishment. And the overlap is chilling. Men who will never leave ADX alive share a haunting parallel with those condemned to death but left to wait for decades in solitary confinement. Both systems raise the same uncomfortable question. Where does justice end and cruelty begin? This is the bridge between the fortress in the desert and the forgotten corridors of death row. To understand the full weight of America's most isolated prison, we must also confront the stories of those who live under the shadow of execution, not knowing when or if the state will carry out its promise. If ADX Florence is designed to keep men physically locked away from the outside world, then death row is designed to keep them suspended in time. Across the United States, thousands of men and women live under sentences of death, confined in small cells for decades, waiting for executions that, in many cases, never come. It is not just a prison sentence. It is a limbo where life, death, and justice blur together in a haunting standstill. California offers the most striking example. At San Quentin State Prison, perched on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, sits the nation's largest death row. More than 600 men are confined here, officially sentenced to die. Yet California has not carried out an execution since 2006. In 2019, then-Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium on executions, calling the death penalty system irreversible and unjust. Still, the prisoners remain locked down, their sentences unchanged. They cannot be executed, but they cannot be freed. For many, the years stretch on endlessly, appeals winding through the courts, lawyers cycling in and out, while life inside the cell grows smaller and smaller. Conditions mirror those at supermax facilities. Inmates on death row often spend 23 hours a day inside a single cell, with little more than a bed, a toilet, and a few personal belongings. Their human contact is minimal, sometimes limited to brief encounters with guards or attorneys. Meals are eaten alone, recreation is tightly restricted, and conversation with fellow prisoners may be reduced to shouting through the cracks in concrete walls. Advocacy groups describe the experience as death before dying, an erosion of the human spirit long before the state ever carries out its sentence. The stories of individual men reveal the brutal contradictions of this system. Anthony Ray Hinton, for instance, spent nearly 30 years on Alabama's death row for crimes he did not commit. He was finally exonerated in 2015 after new ballistics testing proved that the bullets from the crime scene did not match his mother's old revolver, the prosecution's central evidence. During his decades of wrongful imprisonment, Hinton watched 54 fellow inmates walk to their executions. His case stands as one of the starkest examples of how fragile and error-prone the death penalty system can be. Others have not been as fortunate. Many inmates have died of natural causes while waiting for appeals, never executed, but never exonerated either. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution in the U.S. now exceeds 20 years. In some states, it can stretch far longer. These men and women often grow old in their cells, their health deteriorating under conditions of isolation, until their sentences become de facto life terms without parole. The uncertainty carries its own psychological toll. Former wardens, psychologists, and legal experts have all described death row confinement as uniquely punishing, not because of physical hardship, but because of the endless waiting. Inmates live with the knowledge that the state has marked them for death, but the when, the how, and even the if remain in constant doubt. Some compare it to psychological torture, where the stress of anticipation can be more devastating than the execution itself. This reality is not limited to California. States like Texas, Florida, and Alabama remain among the most active in pursuing executions. Yet even there, death row inmates can wait decades before their sentences are carried out. In Florida, prisoners have challenged the constitutionality of living in solitary confinement for 20, 30, or even 40 years while appeals drag on. In Texas, home to the nation's busiest execution chamber, inmates can spend years in near isolation, knowing that one day their names will be called and their journey will end in Huntsville, inside the death chamber with its infamous gurney. The haunting irony is clear. While ADX Florence is a place from which no one has ever escaped, death row is a place from which almost no one returns. Both institutions are built to remove people from the flow of ordinary life, but they do so in different ways. One through physical penetrability, the other through the slow erosion of time. Together, they reflect the extremes of American punishment, one where freedom is locked away forever, and one where life itself is held hostage by the courts. As debates over the death penalty continue, public opinion has shifted. Polls show that support for executions has declined steadily since the 1990s, as concerns over wrongful convictions, racial disparities, and the costs of capital punishment mount. Several states, including Virginia and Illinois, have abolished the death penalty altogether in recent years. Others maintain moratoriums, effectively halting executions without formally ending the practice. Yet death row prisoners remain in their cells, their sentences unchanged, their futures unresolved. The question, then, is not only about the morality of execution, but about the morality of confinement itself. If decades of isolation on death row can amount to death by waiting, is it fundamentally different from the indefinite solitary confinement practiced at ADX Florence? Both environments raise the same challenge: whether a society committed to justice can justify practices that seem designed not only to punish, but to break the human spirit. At first glance, ADX Florence and America's death rows could not be more different. One is a fortress in the Colorado desert, built with steel, sensors, and razor wire to contain the most infamous criminals in America. The other exists across dozens of state prisons, scattered from Texas to California, holding men and women sentenced to die. Yet beneath the surface, they mirror one another in chilling ways. Both are designed around one central idea: to remove people from society so completely that their existence becomes nearly invisible. ADX does this through absolute control. The prison's architecture itself is a weapon: narrow sightlines, soundproof doors, remote-controlled locks, and an endless maze of barriers that ensure prisoners rarely, if ever, encounter one another. Even in recreation, inmates step alone into small, caged enclosures, unable to see more than a sliver of sky. Prison officials describe it as a management strategy. Critics describe it as sensory deprivation. Whatever the label, the effect is the same: lives reduced to routine, stripped of human contact, suspended in silence. Death row achieves the same result through uncertainty. Instead of walls and technology, it uses time. Inmates are kept isolated not because they are likely to escape, but because the system insists they must be separated from the general population while their cases crawl through the courts. The years accumulate like sediment. One appeal denied, another delayed, another lawyer assigned. For some, decades pass without resolution. Their punishment becomes not the execution itself, but the relentless anticipation of it. In both places, the human cost is undeniable. Psychologists have documented high rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm among prisoners in extended solitary confinement. Former ADX inmates describe hearing voices, banging their heads against walls, or cutting themselves just to feel something real. On death row, men have described panic attacks, insomnia, and the constant terror of hearing footsteps approach their cell at night, unsure if it is the guard arriving with news that their execution date has been set. The legal system has grappled with these realities, though often reluctantly. In 1995, a federal judge ruled in Madrid versus Gomez that conditions at Pelican Bay State Prison's isolation units violated the Eighth Amendment for mentally ill inmates, recognizing that solitary confinement could cross into unconstitutional territory. More recently, lawsuits against ADX Florence led to settlements requiring better mental health care. On the death penalty side, exonerations like that of Anthony Ray Hinton have forced courts to confront the risk of wrongful convictions, with organizations like the Innocence Project uncovering dozens of cases where DNA evidence proved inmates on death row were innocent. And yet, despite these rulings, the structures remain. ADX Florence continues to operate as the most secure prison in the federal system. Death rows across America continue to confine hundreds of men and women, even in states where executions have been suspended indefinitely. The persistence of these institutions reflects a deeper truth: that American punishment is often less about what works and more about what satisfies a political and cultural demand for retribution and control. The parallels even extend to public perception. Both ADX and death row occupy a kind of mythic space in the American imagination. News reports describe ADX as the place where the worst of the worst are sent, a living tomb for terrorists, drug lords, and traitors. Death row is portrayed as the last stop for killers whose crimes shocked communities. In both cases, the institutions are framed as necessary evils, symbols of justice too severe for ordinary prisons to handle. Yet rarely do the public see the day-to-day reality. Men aging, deteriorating, and breaking down under conditions designed not for rehabilitation, but for permanent removal. There is, however, one critical difference. At ADX, the state makes no secret of its intention. Prisoners are not expected to leave. It is, in essence, a life sentence carried out through endless isolation. On death row, by contrast, the state insists that executions remain the ultimate goal, even if in practice, decades pass without the sentence being carried out. This gap between stated purpose and actual outcome creates what scholars call a liminal space, where prisoners live in a shadow world of neither life nor death, neither punishment completed nor relief granted. For those inside, the results are hauntingly similar. Whether sitting in a concrete cell in Colorado or waiting for decades in San Quentin, the reality is one of abandonment. The outside world moves forward. Elections, wars, cultural shifts, while inside, time freezes. In this way, ADX Florence and America's death rows are not opposites, but reflections. Two different architectures for the same underlying idea, that the most severe punishment is not just loss of freedom, but loss of humanity. Numbers and statistics can tell us that ADX Florence has never had a successful escape, or that California holds more than 600 people on death row. But it is the personal stories of those locked inside that reveal the human cost of America's harshest punishments. Behind every concrete wall and every steel door is a man whose name once filled headlines, or in some cases, never left the prison gates at all. One of ADX Florence's most notorious residents is Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the Mexican drug lord who once commanded the Sinaloa cartel. Known for spectacular prison escapes in Mexico, including a mile-long tunnel carved beneath a shower stall, Guzman was extradited to the United States in 2017 and sentenced to life plus 30 years. His arrival at ADX was widely publicized. The escape artist was now housed in a PNKTNMTS. Risen where tunnels are impossible, where every door is controlled remotely, and where even communication with the outside world is heavily restricted. For Guzman, the concrete box was more than a cell. It was the end of his myth of invincibility. Another inmate was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. After a nationwide manhunt, he was captured in 1996 and sentenced to life in prison. At ADX, he lived for years in solitary confinement before his transfer to a medical facility in 2021, shortly before his death in 2023. Kaczynski, a man who once railed against modern technology, found himself in one of the most technologically controlled environments on Earth, a bitter irony that underscored the prison's reputation as a place where even ideology is smothered by silence. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, convicted for the Boston Marathon bombing, is another name etched into ADX's walls. Sentenced to death, his case embodies the overlap between ADX and death row. Although he lives under the daily regime of ADX isolation, his ultimate fate lies in the appeals process surrounding his death sentence. For Tsarnaev, the uncertainty of death row exists within the certainty of ADX confinement, combining the worst of both systems into one. On the other side of the country in Alabama, Anthony Ray Hinton lived a different kind of nightmare. Wrongfully convicted of 2 murders in 1985, he was sentenced to death and spent nearly 3 decades in a cell the size of a parking space. Hinton maintained his innocence from day one, but it wasn't until the Equal Justice Initiative took on his case that new ballistics testing proved the bullets did not match the alleged murder weapon. When he was finally freed in 2015, he had lost 30 years of his life, but not his spirit. Hinton has since written and spoken about the psychological torment of death row, describing it as a place where hope goes to die. There are others whose stories have not ended in freedom. Dozens of men across Florida, Texas, and California have spent 20, 30, even 40 years under sentence of death, only to die of illness before ever facing execution. In California alone, more than 100 prisoners on death row have died of natural causes since executions were halted in 2006. For them, death row became not a waiting room for the execution chamber, but a hospice ward inside a prison. The parallels become stark. El Chapo will likely die inside ADX, never to taste freedom again. Tsarnaev lives under both supermax conditions and a death sentence, embodying the overlap between the two systems. Hinton's story shows that wrongful convictions can trap men in a legal death sentence for decades, only to be overturned after most of a lifetime is lost. Each example highlights how the combination of extreme isolation and indefinite confinement shapes not just public policy, but human destiny. These stories force us to ask, what does it mean for a society to create places where men are designed to disappear? ADX Florence erases prisoners physically, removing them from human contact, locking them in a silence so deep that the outside world forgets them. Death row erases prisoners through time, stretching their punishment into decades of waiting, with an execution date that may never arrive. Both methods destroy lives, but they do so invisibly, hidden behind walls the public rarely sees. Journalists who have visited San Quentin's death row describe long corridors of steel-barred cells, where prisoners spend their days sketching, reading, or simply staring at the walls. At ADX, lawyers who've met clients recall walking through a series of steel doors, each clanging shut behind them, until they reached a concrete cell where a man sat in silence, chained at the wrists and ankles. The atmosphere is the same, heavy, oppressive, built to remind both prisoner and visitor that escape is not just unlikely, it is unthinkable. These personal stories illuminate the broader truth. Whether infamous like Guzman, ideological like Kaczynski, convicted like Tsarnaev, or innocent like Hinton, all endure the same fundamental reality: isolation that stretches beyond punishment into the realm of erasure. They are not just prisoners, they are symbols of a system that measures justice not in rehabilitation, but in how completely it can lock a human being away. If concrete and steel are the weapons of ADX Florence and time is the weapon of death row, then the battlefield is the human mind. Psychologists who have studied both environments agree. The damage of extreme isolation is not always visible on the body, but it leaves scars on the brain that can last a lifetime. The United Nations defines prolonged solitary confinement, more than 15 consecutive days, as a form of torture. At ADX Florence, isolation is not measured in days, but in years. Prisoners routinely spend decades in cells no bigger than a walk-in closet, cut off from human contact. Former inmates describe hearing phantom voices, seeing hallucinations in the cracks of the wall, or losing track of time entirely. Some bang their heads against the concrete just to feel something real. Others slash at their skin with makeshift blades, desperate for proof that they still exist. Doctors call this phenomenon SHU syndrome, named after the security housing units, where solitary confinement is most severe. Symptoms include anxiety, panic attacks, paranoia, memory loss, and depression. Over time, the brain begins to deteriorate under the stress of sensory deprivation. Even men who once considered themselves strong, gang leaders, terrorists, hardened criminals, have broken down in tears inside ADX's concrete boxes. As one former warden admitted, "We didn't build this place for rehabilitation. We built it to break men." Death row carries its own psychological toll, sometimes referred to as death row syndrome. Unlike ADX, where the cruelty is spatial, death row's cruelty is temporal. The condemned live for decades under the shadow of execution, never knowing when the final date will arrive. Psychologists compare it to a form of anticipatory grief, like living your own funeral every day. Some prisoners sink into deep depression. Others suffer from insomnia and paranoia. The stress of waiting has led to suicides, heart attacks, and mental breakdowns long before the execution ever comes. Research from states like Florida and Texas shows that death row inmates are disproportionately likely to develop severe mental illnesses over time. Lawyers often report that by the time their clients exhaust their appeals, they are no longer competent to understand their own execution date. Courts have occasionally stayed executions on these grounds, citing the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. But even then, the inmate is simply returned to the same cell, the same isolation, the same cycle of waiting. International human rights organizations have condemned both systems. Amnesty International has described the conditions at ADX Florence as inhuman and degrading. The United Nations has repeatedly urged the United States to abolish long-term solitary confinement, citing its psychological harm. On death row, the European Court of Human Rights has refused to extradite prisoners to the U.S. unless assured they will not face execution, citing the cruelty of prolonged death row confinement. In both cases, global consensus is clear. The practices amount to torture by another name. Yet inside the United States, these practices persist. Supporters argue that ADX is necessary to contain the most dangerous prisoners, men who have killed guards, escaped from other prisons, or master-minded attacks. They argue that death row reflects the will of juries and victims' families, who demand the ultimate punishment for the most heinous crimes. Critics counter that safety and justice can be achieved without destroying the human mind in the process. The science leaves little room for doubt. Solitary confinement alters brain chemistry. Extended isolation reduces neural activity, disrupts circadian rhythms, and impairs memory. Prisoners often emerge unable to interact with others, their social skills eroded by years of silence. On death row, prolonged waiting produces chronic stress responses, higher cortisol levels, weakened immune systems, and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In both environments, the punishment extends far beyond the sentence, reshaping the very biology of those confined. For the public, these realities are easy to overlook. ADX Florence is sealed away in the Colorado desert, invisible behind layers of security. Death rows are scattered, tucked into corners of aging state prisons, far from view. But for the men inside, the effects are constant, unavoidable, and deeply human. As one former prisoner wrote after years in solitary, "It is not the walls that crush you, it is the silence." The question then becomes unavoidable. If punishment destroys not only the body but the mind, does it cross the line from justice into cruelty? And if the answer is yes, what does it mean for a nation that continues to operate both the world's most secure supermax and the largest death row system in the Western world? In the United States, punishment is not only carried out inside prison walls, it is debated in courtrooms, legislatures, and political campaigns. ADX, Florence, and death row are not just institutions. They are battlegrounds where law, politics, and public opinion collide. The history of ADX Florence itself begins with law and policy. In the 1980s, after 2 federal correctional officers were murdered at USP Marion, Congress and the Department of Justice demanded a solution. The result was the supermax concept, a prison so secure that even the most violent inmates could be controlled. When ADX opened in 1994, it was hailed as a triumph of order over chaos. Politicians praised it as the ultimate safeguard against terrorism, organized crime, and prison violence. The law gave wardens sweeping authority to impose solitary confinement, with courts deferring to security needs whenever challenged. But lawsuits soon followed. In 2012, a group of ADX prisoners filed a class action suit alleging that the prison systematically denied mental health care, leaving men with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and PTSD to deteriorate in isolation. One of the plaintiffs, Jack Powers, described years of self-mutilation and suicide attempts inside his cell. The case, Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, ended in a settlement that required reforms, such as mental health screening, transfer of severely ill inmates to treatment facilities, and staff training. While the settlement marked progress, critics argue it addressed only the most extreme cases, leaving the broader use of long-term isolation untouched. The courts have also weighed in on solitary confinement more generally. Federal rulings have acknowledged its psychological harms, but judges often stop short of banning the practice outright. Instead, they require case-by-case reviews, deferring to prison administrators' claims of necessity. The result is a patchwork. Some inmates win transfers or limited relief, while the system of isolation remains largely intact. Death row, meanwhile, has been the subject of some of the fiercest legal battles in American history. Since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976 after a brief national moratorium, states have executed more than 1,500 people. Yet legal challenges have reshaped nearly every aspect of the process, from who can be sentenced, to how executions are carried out, to whether decades of solitary confinement amount to cruel and unusual punishment. One landmark case was Furman v. Georgia, 1972, in which the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty as arbitrary and discriminatory. The ruling led to a 4-year nationwide pause until states rewrote their laws. Later, in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, the court ruled that executing people with intellectual disabilities violated the Eighth Amendment. In Roper v. Simmons, 2005, it barred executions for crimes committed by juveniles. These cases signaled the court's willingness to narrow the scope of the death penalty, even while leaving it in place. Still, challenges remain unresolved. Inmates continue to argue that decades on death row, sometimes 30 or 40 years, constitute a death row phenomenon that violates human rights. While international courts have recognized this argument, American courts have largely dismissed it, maintaining that lengthy appeals are necessary to protect due process. The paradox is striking. The very delays meant to safeguard fairness become the reason prisoners spend decades in limbo. Politics play a decisive role. Governors can commute sentences or impose moratoriums, as Gavin Newsom did in California in 2019. Other governors, particularly in southern states, campaign on promises to speed up executions, framing them as justice for victims. The death penalty has become a cultural marker, dividing states and regions. Today, 23 states have abolished it, while others like Texas and Florida remain active executioners. Public opinion has shifted too. Support for the death penalty has dropped from nearly 80% in the 1990s to around 55% today. ADX Florence, by contrast, is less visible in political debates but equally controversial. Civil rights groups and international organizations have called for its closure, citing human rights violations. Yet few politicians want to appear soft on crime by challenging a prison that houses terrorists, cartel leaders, and violent gang figures. For now, ADX remains insulated from major political reform, defended as a necessary tool of national security. The intersection of these two systems reveals a deeper truth about American justice. Both are shaped as much by politics as by law. Solitary confinement and death row persist not because they are the most effective methods of punishment, but because they symbolize toughness, control, and retribution. Reform efforts often face resistance from those who argue that the worst criminals deserve the harshest conditions, regardless of human cost. Yet cracks are appearing. Lawsuits against solitary confinement have gained traction. States continue to abolish or limit the death penalty. Even within corrections, some officials now question whether extreme isolation prevents violence or simply breeds more despair. What was once considered untouchable is now subject to debate, both in courtrooms and in the court of public opinion. The question is whether these debates will lead to real change, or whether ADX Florence and America's death rows will remain monuments to a form of justice that values punishment above all else. The United States stands out on the world stage not only for the size of its prison population, but also for the severity of its punishment. ADX Florence and America's sprawling death rows are institutions with few equivalents anywhere else. Looking abroad reveals how unusual, some would say extreme, the American approach to punishment truly is. In Europe, the death penalty has been almost entirely abolished. The European Union prohibits member states from carrying out executions, and the Council of Europe requires abolition as a condition of membership. Countries such as France, Germany, and the United Kingdom ended executions decades ago. Today, extradition treaties often include clauses preventing transfer of suspects to the U.S. unless prosecutors promise not to seek the death penalty. For European courts, the very existence of death row and the decades-long confinement it entails constitutes a human rights violation. Even in countries that maintain capital punishment, the scale is vastly different. Japan, for example, still executes prisoners, but its death row is relatively small, fewer than 120 inmates. Conditions are also harsh. Prisoners are kept in near-total isolation, and execution dates are not revealed until the morning they occur. Yet the length of confinement is shorter, and the system does not carry the backlog seen in the United States. China, believed to carry out the highest number of executions in the world, does not maintain massive death row populations. Instead, sentences are carried out swiftly, often within months or a few years. In contrast, America's decades-long death row waits are unique, creating a limbo that other nations regard as cruel and unusual. When it comes to high-security imprisonment, comparisons are equally revealing. The United Kingdom operates HMP Belmarsh, a maximum security facility in London that houses terrorists, organized crime figures, and high-profile prisoners. Belmarsh is heavily fortified, with restrictions rivaling American supermaxes, but inmates still have some opportunity for human interaction, education programs, and visits. Scandinavian countries, often praised for progressive approaches, operate prisons such as Halden in Norway, where even dangerous offenders are housed in humane conditions, given access to education, and prepared for eventual reintegration. To Americans, Halden might look more like a college campus than a prison, yet Norway boasts one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world. No country has built a prison quite like ADX Florence. While nations like Australia and Canada have experimented with supermax-style facilities, none approach the scale or intensity of ADX's regime of near-total isolation. Human rights monitors frequently cite ADX as an outlier, a prison designed not for rehabilitation or even deterrence, but for permanent incapacitation. In the words of Amnesty International, it is a place designed for the annihilation of the human spirit. These international contrasts highlight a paradox. The United States often presents itself as a global leader in democracy and human rights, yet maintains practices condemned abroad. The death penalty, for instance, aligns the U.S. more closely with countries like China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia than with its Western allies. ADX Florence, meanwhile, reflects a philosophy of punishment far removed from the rehabilitative models embraced in much of Europe. Some American officials defend this divergence. They argue that the scale of crime, the threat of terrorism, and the influence of organized cartels require uniquely severe measures. The U.S., they say, faces challenges that nations like Norway or the UK do not, necessitating prisons like ADX and systems like death row. But critics respond that severity has not translated into safety. Despite its supermax prisons and death penalty, America continues to struggle with high rates of violence and incarceration, suggesting that these harsh measures may serve symbolism more than effectiveness. International pressure has begun to influence domestic debates. When foreign courts refuse extradition over death penalty concerns, it forces U.S. prosecutors to choose between abandoning capital punishment or losing the ability to try high-profile suspects. Similarly, reports by the United Nations and human rights groups have placed ADX Florence under a spotlight. 8. Questioning whether the United States violates international law by keeping men in permanent isolation. The comparison is clear. While other nations emphasize rehabilitation, reintegration, or swift justice, the United States has chosen a path of prolonged confinement and ultimate finality. Death row and ADX Florence are not anomalies. They are reflections of a broader philosophy that punishment must be severe to be legitimate. Yet as the world moves in a different direction, America's stance becomes increasingly isolated, just like the prisoners it confines. Prisons are not just about those locked inside. Their impact ripples outward, touching families, victims, and the men and women who work behind the walls every day. To understand the full weight of ADX Florence and America's death rows, we must also hear the voices of those who live in their shadows. For families of inmates, the experience can be a sentence of its own. Visiting ADX Florence is notoriously difficult. The prison sits in the remote high desert of Colorado, far from major airports or cities. Families often travel hundreds of miles only to spend a brief, heavily monitored visit separated by thick glass. Physical contact is non-existent. Phone calls are rare and closely monitored. For many, relationships with imprisoned fathers, brothers, or sons erode over time, worn down by distance and silence. Mothers have spoken of writing letters for years, unsure if they will ever receive a reply. Children have grown into adults with little more than memories of a parent taken away. The same is true for death row families. In California, the wives, children, and parents of condemned men often live for decades with the uncertainty of whether their loved one will ever be executed or ever freed. In Alabama, Anthony Ray Hinton's mother continued visiting him on death row, year after year, clinging to hope that the courts would one day believe his innocence. For her, every visit was a reminder that her son's life hung in limbo. Families of guilty inmates, too, endure the strain. They are punished not by law, but by stigma, often ostracized in their communities for being related to someone condemned to die. Victims' families carry a different burden. For some, the existence of ADX Florence and death row represents justice. Knowing that the man who killed their loved one will never walk free, or may one day face execution, provides a sense of closure. They see the fortress in Colorado and the gurney in Huntsville as symbols that the system values their loss. But not all victims' families agree. Over the years, many have spoken out against the death penalty, arguing that decades of appeals re-traumatize them rather than bring peace. Each court hearing, each new date set and delayed, reopens wounds that never heal. For these families, the drawn-out process feels like another punishment, and life without parole would be a more humane resolution. Then there are the prison staff, the unseen workforce that makes these institutions function. At ADX Florence, correctional officers work in an environment unlike any other in the country. They patrol sterile corridors where silence is broken only by the buzz of electronic doors. They monitor inmates who rarely leave their cells, reducing physical conflict but heightening psychological strain. Some officers describe pride in working at the most secure prison in America, while others admit to burnout and trauma from daily exposure to men in extreme isolation. One former officer recalled, "It's not just the inmates who go crazy in there. Sometimes it's us." On death row, staff face their own dilemmas. Guards who supervise condemned inmates form relationships over years and decades, only to one day be asked to escort them to the execution chamber. Chaplains sit with men during their final moments, offering prayers even as the state prepares to end their lives. Execution teams carry out the final act, administering lethal injections in sterile rooms designed to make death look clinical. Some staff have later confessed to nightmares, PTSD, or moral conflict over their role. The process is bureaucratic on the outside, but deeply human for those tasked with carrying it out. These voices complicate the picture. Families of inmates plead for mercy. Victims' families are divided between retribution and forgiveness. Staff struggle with the psychological weight of enforcing the harshest punishments the system allows. Together, they remind us that prisons do not exist in isolation from society. They are connected to communities, shaping lives far beyond the prison gates. In this way, ADX Florence and America's death rows are not just institutions of justice. They are institutions of grief, pain, and endurance. Every concrete wall casts a long shadow, and in those shadows stand mothers, fathers, children, widows, guards, chaplains, and executioners, all living with the consequences of a system that punishes not only those inside, but everyone around them. For most Americans, prisons like ADX Florence or the corridors of death row are not experienced firsthand. Instead, they are encountered through headlines, documentaries, films, and TV dramas. Over time, media has transformed these institutions into powerful symbols, places of mystery, fear, and fascination. But the way they are portrayed shapes public debate as much as the realities inside the walls. ADX Florence, for instance, is often described in the press as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. News coverage emphasizes its reputation as the most secure prison in America, home to terrorists, cartel leaders, and notorious criminals. Stories about El Chapo's extradition to ADX portrayed the facility as the one place he could never escape. Journalists highlighted its layers of razor wire, remote-controlled steel doors, and concrete cells, as if describing a fortress from which no man could return. The result is a kind of myth-making. ADX becomes less a correctional facility than a symbol of America's ability to contain evil. Documentaries and TV series have reinforced this image. National Geographic, the History Channel, and Netflix have all produced programs featuring ADX, often with dramatic narration and dark imagery. The prison is framed as a place where the most dangerous humans are entombed, with little focus on the psychological costs of isolation. For audiences, ADX becomes a mix of fear and reassurance, fear of the men locked inside, reassurance that they are locked away forever. Death row, meanwhile, has inspired its own cultural narratives. Films like Dead Man Walking and The Green Mile brought the moral weight of execution to mainstream audiences, highlighting the tension between justice, vengeance, and forgiveness. Documentaries such as The Life of David Gale and The Thin Blue Line raised questions about wrongful convictions and the fallibility of the death penalty. These portrayals often oscillate between two extremes, the condemned as monstrous killers or as tragic figures caught in a flawed system. News coverage, too, plays a pivotal role. High-profile executions draw national attention, with reporters broadcasting from outside prison gates, capturing images of protesters holding candles on one side and victims' families demanding justice on the other. The spectacle becomes part of the narrative, framing execution not just as a legal act, but as a cultural event. In Texas, where executions are most frequent, media coverage has even become ritualized. Press pools report on the inmates' final words, last meal, and the exact time of death. This media lens affects public opinion. When coverage emphasizes heinous crimes, support for harsh punishments often rises. When coverage highlights wrongful convictions or human suffering, support declines. Studies show that public attitudes toward the death penalty are strongly shaped by media exposure, particularly documentaries and investigative journalism that reveal cracks in the system. Similarly, the portrayal of ADX Florence as escape-proof and necessary for safety discourages debate about whether such extreme isolation is humane. Popular culture sometimes glamorizes or sensationalizes these institutions. Crime dramas depict daring escape attempts, while thrillers present death row as a backdrop for last-minute reversals or dramatic confessions. Rarely do these stories capture the monotony of years in solitary confinement, the endless waiting, or the mental breakdowns that characterize the real experience. In this way, fiction can distort reality, making extreme punishment seem more theatrical than torturous. Yet the media has also been a tool for reform. Investigative journalists have exposed wrongful convictions, leading to exonerations for men like Anthony Ray Hinton and Walter McMillian. Reports on suicides at ADX Florence have sparked lawsuits and settlements, forcing the Bureau of Prisons to address mental health care. Advocacy groups use documentaries and social media campaigns to shift public opinion, framing the death penalty as outdated and solitary confinement as cruel. Without media, many of these hidden realities would never reach the public. The paradox is that ADX Florence and death row are both hidden and hypervisible. Few outsiders will ever step inside ADX or San Quentin's death row, yet millions feel they know these places through the stories told about them. The narratives, however, are selective, shaped by what sells headlines, wins ratings, or sparks political debate. For those who live inside, the reality is often more mundane, more brutal, and less cinematic than the public ever imagines. In the end, media shapes not just perception, but policy. Politicians respond to public fear and outrage, often fueled by sensational coverage, by promising harsher penalties or resisting reform. At the same time, growing exposure to wrongful convictions through documentaries and podcasts has shifted opinion away from executions, leading to moratoriums and abolition in some states. ADX Florence remains largely untouched by reform because its myth as an impregnable fortress overshadows questions of human rights. Thus, the court of public opinion, fueled by media and culture, becomes as important as any courtroom in determining the future of America's harshest prisons. Behind every prison wall is not just steel and concrete, but dollars and cents. The cost of operating ADX Florence and maintaining death rows across America is immense, raising questions not only about morality, but about money. Extreme punishment does not come cheap, and taxpayers often bear the hidden costs of institutions built to isolate rather than rehabilitate. Let's begin with ADX Florence. Constructed in the early 1990s at a price tag of about $60 million, the prison was billed as a fortress for the worst of the worst. But the expense did not end with construction. Operating a supermax facility requires enormous resources, advanced security systems, highly trained staff, medical units capable of handling long-term solitary confinement, and constant surveillance. Each inmate at ADX costs significantly more to house than those in general population prisons. Analysts estimate that per-prisoner costs at ADX can be 2 to 3 times higher than at standard federal facilities, driven by the need for higher staffing ratios, specialized technology, and security protocols. Critics argue that the investment has little measurable return. With fewer than 500 prisoners at capacity, ADX houses only a tiny fraction of the federal inmate population, yet its budget rivals that of much larger facilities. Advocates for reform suggest that resources poured into indefinite solitary confinement could be redirected toward mental health treatment, rehabilitation programs, or crime prevention efforts that serve the broader public. Death row carries its own financial burden. Studies consistently show that prosecuting, sentencing, and housing a prisoner on death row costs far more than sentencing someone to life without parole. The reasons are complex. Death penalty trials require more attorneys, longer jury selections, expert witnesses, and years of appeals. In California, for example, a 2011 study estimated that the state had spent over $4 billion on its death penalty system since 1978, largely on legal costs and maintaining death row, while carrying out just 13 executions. That amounts to more than $300 million per execution. Other states show similar patterns. A 2016 study in Kansas found that death penalty cases cost about 4 times as much as comparable non-capital cases. In Florida, the average cost per execution has been estimated at $24 million. Even in Texas, which executes more inmates than any other state, death penalty cases drain millions from state budgets, much of it spent on lengthy appeals that rarely change the outcome. Housing costs add another layer. Prisoners on death row are often held in higher security units, requiring more guards and resources. Because they spend decades in solitary-like conditions, the price of maintaining facilities mirrors that of supermax prisons. Add in medical care as inmates age, and the bills rise further. By contrast, life without parole, though still costly, consistently proves cheaper over the long term. These financial realities complicate the politics of punishment. Supporters of the death penalty argue that justice should not be measured in dollars, and that cost should not outweigh the value of retribution or deterrence. Advocates for ADX make similar claims, insisting that the cost of housing the most dangerous men is justified by the safety it ensures. But opponents point to the staggering expenses as proof that both systems are inefficient and unsustainable. For taxpayers, the question is unavoidable. Is extreme punishment worth the price? In California, public frustration with the billions spent on a death penalty system that rarely results in executions has fueled growing support for abolition. In Colorado, debates about ADX's cost have surfaced in discussions about whether supermax confinement is truly necessary for so many inmates. Economists and reform advocates suggest that the billions spent on execution chambers and isolation cells could be redirected to education, healthcare, or community safety initiatives that prevent crime before it happens. The economics also expose inequalities. Wealthier defendants are less likely to end up on death row, as they can afford better legal defense. Poorer defendants, disproportionately people of color, rely on overworked public defenders, making them more vulnerable to wrongful convictions. In this way, the financial cost intersects with social cost, creating a system where the price of justice is unevenly distributed. Perhaps most striking is the paradox. The death penalty was once defended as a cheaper alternative to life imprisonment, and supermax prisons were once justified as a cost-saving measure to control violent inmates. In practice, both have proven to be among the most expensive forms of punishment. What began as promises of efficiency has become a financial drain, raising the question of whether America can afford its harshest institutions, not just morally, but fiscally. To understand ADX Florence and America's death rows, we must step back into history. Neither institution emerged overnight. Both are products of centuries of evolving ideas about crime, punishment, and control. Their roots lie in the penitentiaries of the 19th century and the gallows of colonial America, reshaped by decades of reform, backlash, and political calculation. In the early 1800s, the United States pioneered the modern penitentiary. The idea was revolutionary at the time. Rather than flogging, branding, or public executions, criminals would be locked away to reflect on their sins. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia introduced the concept of solitary confinement as a path to penitence. Prisoners were kept alone in cells, forced into silence, and given only a Bible for reflection. Reformers believed solitude would lead to redemption. Instead, it often produced madness. Charles Dickens, after visiting in 1842, described it as cruel and wrong, noting that prisoners were buried alive. By the 20th century, solitary confinement had spread across America's prisons, but always as a tool, not an entire system. Inmates who broke rules might be placed in isolation for days or weeks, but rarely for years. That changed after a violent turning point in 1983, when 2 guards at USP Marion in Illinois were murdered by inmates associated with radical groups. In response, the prison imposed a permanent lockdown, essentially converting the entire facility into a solitary confinement unit. What began as a temporary measure became a model. If violence could be suppressed through permanent isolation, why not build prisons designed entirely around that principle? Thus, the supermax was born. In 1994, ADX Florence opened its gates, hailed as the solution to the chaos of Marion. No longer would violent prisoners pose a threat to staff or fellow inmates. At ADX, every detail was engineered to eliminate risk. Narrow windows to prevent communication, electronically controlled doors to reduce guard contact, recreation in individual cages. The prison embodied a new philosophy, that some men were beyond rehabilitation, fit only for permanent containment. The death penalty's evolution followed a different trajectory, rooted in America's colonial past. In the 1600s and 1700s, executions were swift and public. Crimes ranging from murder to theft could carry the death sentence, carried out within days or weeks. Crowds gathered in town squares to watch hangings, viewing them as both punishment and spectacle. By the 20th century, methods changed. The electric chair, gas chamber, and later lethal injection promised executions that were quicker, more humane, and less visibly gruesome. But as methods modernized, the process slowed. Legal challenges increased, appeals grew longer, and the rights of defendants expanded. The 1972 Supreme Court case Furman v. Georgia effectively halted the death penalty nationwide, ruling that it was applied arbitrarily and often discriminatorily. 4 years later, in Gregg v. Georgia, the court reinstated it under new guidelines, requiring stricter sentencing procedures. This new legal framework lengthened the timeline of executions dramatically. What once took weeks now took decades. Appeals became the norm, and with them, death row was born, not as a temporary holding place, but as a permanent condition. Prisoners sentenced to die now waited 20, 30, sometimes 40 years before the state carried out, or abandoned, their execution. The limbo of death row became one of the defining features of American justice. Together, these shifts reveal a broader pattern. When confronted with violence or controversy, America often responds not with moderation, but with escalation. The murders at Marion produced ADX Florence, a prison built to eliminate contact altogether. Legal challenges to the death penalty produced a system where executions became rarer, but confinement harsher. The result is a paradox. In seeking greater control and fairness, the nation created institutions that amplify suffering in new ways. Today, the legacy of these evolutions is clear. ADX Florence represents the culmination of 2 centuries of faith in solitary confinement, from Eastern States' failed experiment to Marion's lockdown. Death row represents the unintended consequence of judicial reform, transforming executions into decades-long ordeals. Both institutions are modern creations, yet both are haunted by history, shaped by old ideas about sin, violence, and retribution that never fully disappeared. The story of ADX Florence and America's death rows is not just about crime or justice. It is about politics. For decades, leaders have built careers on being tough on crime, and institutions like the supermax and the death chamber became powerful symbols in that theater of punishment. In the 1980s and 1990s, crime rates were high and public fear ran deep. Politicians from both parties seized the moment, pushing policies that expanded incarceration, lengthened sentences, and promised harsher punishment for the worst of the worst. It was during this era that ADX Florence was conceived, not only as a tool for control, but as a statement. America would not tolerate prison violence, terrorism, or cartel power. Presidents and members of Congress pointed to the supermax as proof of strength, a place where enemies of the state could be buried out of sight. The death penalty carried the same political weight. Governors signed death warrants to appear decisive, and presidential candidates declared support for executions to project toughness. In 1992, Bill Clinton famously left the campaign trail to oversee the execution of a mentally impaired inmate in Arkansas, a move widely seen as an attempt to blunt criticism that Democrats were soft on crime. In states like Texas, rapid executions became political currency, with governors touting the death chamber as evidence of swift justice. Public fear played a central role. After the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the September 11th attacks in 2001, and waves of violent crime, Americans demanded visible proof that justice was being served. ADX Florence became the silent answer. Terrorists and mass killers locked away forever. Death row became the other, a promise that the state could exact the ultimate price for the ultimate crimes. In both cases, the institutions were as much about reassurance as about safety. Yet politics also shifted with time. As violent crime declined in the 2000s and 2010s, and as wrongful convictions came to light, the appeal of tough on crime began to wane. Governors like Gavin Newsom in California declared moratoriums on executions, citing injustice and cost. Some lawmakers began questioning the logic of isolating hundreds of men in ADX at enormous expense. Polls showed declining support for the death penalty, especially among younger generations. Still, the symbolism remains powerful, and few politicians are willing to be seen as weak on crime by challenging supermax confinement or dismantling death row entirely. This political theater reveals the truth. ADX Florence and America's death rows are not just products of law or necessity, they are products of fear, power, and the desire to control public perception. They endure not because they are the best solutions, but because they are the most visible ones. And until the politics of fear give way to the politics of reform, they will remain cornerstones of America's harshest brand of justice. From the fortress in the Colorado desert to the corridors of death row, America has built prisons that do more than punish. They erase. ADX. Florence silences men in concrete boxes, while death row holds them hostage to time itself. Together, they represent the extremes of a system shaped by history, fueled by politics, and defended by fear. No one has ever escaped ADX, and few have ever escaped death row. Yet the debate rages on. Is this justice or cruelty in disguise? As the world looks on, one truth remains: how a nation treats its most dangerous and its most despised says as much about the society outside the walls as it does about those locked within them.